Isabela arrived at the small town with the sense that silence was embedded in the stones and trees surrounding the frozen lake. The snow covered the world like an unrelenting white cloak, and the wind sliced through the air with the coldness of a judgment. There, everything seemed distorted, as if time had dragged itself, recoiling, leaving behind a trace of life that barely resisted the weight of the snow. The few inhabitants of the town hid inside their homes, and the only sounds that could be heard were the whispers of nature and the creaking of wood. The house she rented was old, dark, and far from any other sign of civilization. At times, it felt as though the house itself were alive, breathing like a solitary entity. The garden had been overtaken by wild vegetation and accumulated snow, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that barely allowed the light of day to enter. At night, the house filled with a dense silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind banging against the windows and the memories that insisted on surfacing in the depths of her mind. Isabela found herself there by her own choice, distancing herself from everything that reminded her of Lucas, from everything she could no longer bear. The accident had happened months ago, but grief still consumed her like an invisible disease. In those days, the emptiness seemed to have settled in her chest, and the town, with its harsh climate and desolate appearance, seemed to be the only place capable of embracing her suffering. She knew that there, among those mountains and trees, she would not be disturbed. She wouldn't have to face the questions that arose with every glance, every word she tried to speak about what she had lost. More than anything, she wanted to lose herself in solitude, to let the silence surround her and sink her even deeper into her own pain. As she walked through the house, she felt the coldness of every corner, as if the walls had absorbed the suffering of all those who had lived there. There were no laughter, no music. Only the sound of her breath and the echo of her own footsteps. When she entered the living room, she couldn't help but let her mind return to Lucas, to the last days they had spent together, to the unsaid words and the embraces that would never be given again. She didn't know what she was looking for there. Perhaps stillness was the only answer she could hope for, but even it seemed empty. The weight of loneliness was immense, but something within her was so broken that she no longer knew how to handle the presence of another person. The reflection in the mirror, the one she saw as she moved through the house, seemed like that of a stranger. Her eyes were hollow, and the expression of someone who had seen too much was marked on her face. She avoided looking back to the streets of the town where, in her memory, the people who had shared the world with her before the tragedy still lingered. It was as if the place had the ability to swallow the deepest feelings, obscure painful memories, and at the same time make them more vivid. In her moments of stillness, with the curtains closed and the wind howling outside, Isabela surrendered to the silence and emptiness of the house. Loneliness seemed to be the only company she could still endure, but it also consumed her cruelly. Even so, there was something in those dark hours that brought her a sense of control, of finally being free from the world she hadn't known how to bear. However, as the cold took over the town and winter dragged on endlessly, Isabela began to feel that perhaps it was impossible to escape completely. Even in that solitude, the past accompanied her in every sigh, in every memory that stubbornly infiltrated her empty days. She had withdrawn from life, but life, somehow, was still there, waiting to seep in, to break the silence, and bring with it new pains and perhaps some kind of healing. Isabela's first days in the small town were a silent struggle. She tried to get used to the immense stillness that surrounded her, but the solitude, which initially seemed welcoming, soon became oppressive. The house, with its old furniture and the coldness of its walls, seemed like a reflection of her own soul. The sunlight rarely penetrated through the dusty windows, and even in moments of clarity, the shadow of what she had lost seemed to creep behind every corner. The silence was profound. Every sound, no matter how simple, seemed to stand out. The wind whistling through the cracks in the windows, the rustling of dry leaves in the garden she dared not touch, the faint creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. As Isabela moved through the house, her own footsteps seemed to echo, creating sounds that made her feel even more isolated. Outside, the town streets were rarely seen, and when a solitary soul dared to walk, the distant sound of their steps seemed to belong to another reality, almost non-existent. Isabela began her mornings with a ritual that now seemed empty. The kitchen, cold and dark, was always in disarray, as if the space itself were still adjusting to her presence. She prepared coffee with a mechanical calm, almost as though she were following the routine of someone who no longer cared about what was happening. The aroma of the coffee, normally comforting, no longer offered any solace. It was just another part of her day dragging on endlessly. When she sat at the table, the hot coffee seemed like the only thing alive in that moment of endless waiting. The table, empty, reflected the emptiness of her life. The glass cups were always stained from the last use, but there was no hurry to clean them. Isabela looked at the chair beside her where for so long Lucas had sat. She missed him in every little thing, the way he stirred his cup, the smiles she now imagined, the silent conversations during breakfast. Time seemed frozen, and every memory came like a knife, cutting into her flesh with the reminder of his absence. The house was full of memories. Photograph by photograph, memory by memory, Lucas's figure was there in every corner, in every detail. The picture of him with his easy smile, hugging her on the beach, the image of them together at a simple dinner, where the two seemed like nothing more than a happy reflection of normality. Every part of the house carried the marks of his presence, and Isabela didn't know whether she should try to hide them or fully surrender to the morning. Sometimes she spent hours just staring at those pictures, as if searching for a piece of him that she could reclaim, something she could hold in her hands and feel again. Time, in that first month, felt like a dense, sticky substance, dragging on as if reality itself were suspended. Each minute seemed heavier than the last. She felt the weight of grief invade every mundane gesture, from making the bed to washing the dishes, as if each task were a way to distance herself, even if just for a moment, from the unbearable pain of her own existence. Everything seemed so distant and irrelevant. The town, with its snow-covered streets and distant houses, felt like a reflection of her own disconnection from the world. At night, when the shadows grew long and the house filled with deep silence, Isabela began to confront the most painful memories. She relived, in flashes, the moment of the accident, the last moments she spent with Lucas before tragedy separated them. Every detail returned vividly: the sound of the car crashing, the feeling of helplessness when she received the news, the crushing pain of seeing his body. She couldn't escape these memories, even though they were like open wounds. It was as if the past had become a part of her, impossible to erase or overcome. As winter continued to dominate the town and time dragged on endlessly, Isabela felt the pressure of grief tightening more and more. The silence of the town seemed to reflect what she felt inside. A deep stillness, where the most intense emotions hid, and at the same time the oppression of longing seemed to grow. The town, so remote and desolate, offered an apparent peace, but also a brutal solitude, where her memories were the only real companions. She didn't know if she wanted to escape everything or if she wanted to lose herself in the shadows of the past, but one thing was certain. There, in the silence of the house and the town, she was finally alone with her pain, and that seemed to be the only place where she could reflect on everything she had lost. On a gray and cold morning, as the snow fell silently, Isabela walked through the small town with heavy thoughts, once again immersed in the emptiness of her routine. The sky seemed to weigh down on her, with the low, thick clouds reflecting her inner state. She walked slowly, her steps leaving marks in the fresh snow, soon covered by the constant fall of flakes. The cold air cut through her skin, but the ice within her seemed sharper. It was then, as she turned a corner near the central square, that she bumped into a woman coming from the opposite direction. She was short and serene in appearance, with gray hair tied up in a simple bun. Her face, though marked by time, exuded a calm that Isabela rarely saw in others. The woman smiled slightly, a gesture so unexpected and sincere that for a moment, Isabela didn't know how to react. This woman, whom she had never seen before, seemed to know her. There was something in her eyes, a kind of recognition that Isabela couldn't understand. "You must be Isabela," the woman said softly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "I'm Helena, the town librarian. I remember you. You seemed so happy when you arrived here." Isabela felt an immediate discomfort. How could this woman know anything about her? How could a stranger perceive something so intimate about her feelings? Helena, as if sensing the hesitation, explained calmly, "I saw you arrive, and I couldn't help but notice that your sadness was visible, even in the little things." The phrase felt strangely right, as if Helena had found the exact word to define what Isabela had been trying to hide from herself. An uncomfortable silence followed. Isabela didn't know what to say. She was beginning to feel exposed more than she would have liked. Helena, as if sensing Isabela's unease, softened her tone and said, "I understand what you're feeling. I too had to start over a long time ago after a great sorrow." The words fell on Isabela like an unexpected wave. The empathy of this woman felt so rare, so unusual. She felt something familiar, but at the same time distant in Helena's words. "I lost my daughter," Helena continued, her eyes darkening for a moment. "She left me when I least expected it. It wasn't an accident like yours, but still it was an irreplaceable loss. She left and I had to find a new place, a new beginning. That's why I came here." Isabela felt a knot in her throat. The simple fact of hearing someone speak about pain, about loss, about such a lonely new beginning, made her realize that no matter how unique her suffering was, she wasn't alone in the world. Helena's words, far from easing the pain, seemed to understand the magnitude of what she was facing. It wasn't superficial comfort, but a silent connection, shared between two people who had both experienced solitude in a profound way. Over the following weeks, Isabela began to encounter Helena more frequently. The librarian became a constant presence, someone with whom, reluctantly, she began to share her pain. Not with grand words or dramatic gestures, but with furtive glances, small silences that said more than any sentence could. Each meeting was charged with a quiet intensity. They spoke little, but what they exchanged, a smile, a brief touch on the arm, a whispered sentence, carried the weight of mutual understanding. Helena, with her calm patience, seemed to understand that Isabela didn't need advice or comforting words. She just needed someone to be there, someone who wouldn't force her to expose more than she was ready to reveal. And as much as Isabela tried to resist, she found herself gradually opening up to this woman, who seemed to carry her own scars as deep as Isabela's. Sometimes in their conversations, Helena mentioned the daughter she had lost. She spoke of her with a sweet and bitter nostalgia, like someone still trying to understand the reasons for such a sudden departure. The way she spoke of her daughter, with a mix of pain and acceptance, touched Isabela in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't Helena's pain that moved her, but the way she seemed to carry that pain without allowing it to consume her. The time they spent together, though simple, was deep. Isabela began to realize that perhaps in this isolated place, with the snow covering everything in the biting cold, she could start to rebuild. And by Helena's side, she no longer felt so alone in her grief. Perhaps, after all, there was space for new connections, not to replace what was lost but to learn how to live with it in a different way. And so, little by little, Isabela allowed the pain to become less of a weight, more of a shared memory, a lived experience that in some way connected her to Helena and, who knows, to the world around her. The days dragged on, and the snow continued to fall, covering everything with a cold, white layer that seemed to swallow up the sound and movement around her. As Isabela walked along the lonely paths of the town, she couldn't help but be drawn back to the memories of Lucas. They were simple moments, but now, after his departure, they seemed to possess a painful depth that she had never noticed before. She remembered an autumn morning when Lucas made coffee with a peculiar calm. The image of him, stirring the spoon in his cup, looking at her with a gentle smile, now seemed so distant, as if from another life. The smell of coffee, the sound of the kettle whistling, the warmth of the kitchen. All of it seemed to have happened in a time that no longer existed. The lightness of those days contrasted with the weight she felt now. Every little thing he did, things she had once taken for granted, had become a sharp pain. As if she had lost not just him but all the little things that filled her days. Isabela tried to push these memories away, but they followed her like shadows, appearing at the most unexpected moments. In the town, every corner seemed to hold a fragment of her past life with Lucas. Every street, every tree, seemed imbued with his presence, and she wondered if she would ever be able to free herself from it. The pain seemed to have become a part of her existence, a shadow that would never leave her. It was on a gray late afternoon as she walked toward the frozen lake near her house, that the memories overwhelmed her. The lake, once the place of so many peaceful moments, where they spent hours talking and watching the horizon, now seemed like a distorted mirror of her loss. She approached the edge, feeling the biting cold, and it was as though a wave of pain enveloped her. The ice beneath her feet made a strange sound, and the emptiness she felt seemed to amplify. This was the place where Lucas had died. The place where the accident had happened, where she had lost him in such a brutal, unexpected way. The weight of guilt was crushing. She didn't know exactly what made her feel this way, the sense that, somehow, she could have done something differently, avoided what happened. Lucas had insisted they go out that night to drive across town, but she had hesitated. She didn't want to go, but she ended up going, and now he was no longer there. The thought tortured her endlessly. The accident was so simple and yet so terrible. An unexpected curve in the road, a slip on the ice, a moment of carelessness. And Lucas was no longer there. She knelt by the edge of the lake, feeling the snowflakes fall on her shoulders, her skin cold, her eyes watering from the pain that tore at her chest. The loss wasn't just his physical absence. It was the absence of the whole life she imagined they would have, of all the moments that could never happen now. It was as if the future had been stolen from her, and she was doomed to relive the past, trapped in an endless spiral of what if. The wind howled around her, as if the world itself wanted to remind her of the vast emptiness she felt. Every memory seemed like a sharp blade, and as she tried to push them away, they rooted themselves deeper inside her. Lucas's gaze, his gentle touches, the plans for the future. All of it consumed her. She was paralyzed, unable to move forward. Isabela slowly rose to her feet, struggling, feeling the weight of the memories in every movement. What was left of her life? An empty house, a lifeless town, a frozen lake, and a lost soul. She felt as though she was stuck in time, reliving the same days, the same memories, unable to escape. The questions were constant, overwhelming. What if I had done things differently? What if I had said no? What if I had saved him? The silence of the town, the stillness of the lake, and the solitude of the mountains made her feel as though time was dragging on, and with it, her life too. Isabela didn't know if she would ever be able to leave this weight behind. She wanted to believe there was a way forward, but deep down she knew that longing and guilt kept her captive, as if she were destined to carry this pain forever. And so, she slowly moved away from the edge of the lake, without answers, without comfort. Just another step in the long journey that seemed endless. Time passed slowly in the isolated town, as if the days stretched into an eternity of endless winters. Isabela continued to carry the weight of her loss, but something inside her began to change. Her relationship with Helena, which had once seemed like a casual coincidence, became something deeper, a thread of connection that kept her anchored in the present, even though inside she still felt adrift. Helena, with her quiet calm, seemed to understand in a way no one else could. When she spoke about her own pain, the abandonment of her daughter, and the decision to isolate herself in the town to rebuild her life, Isabela felt a silent empathy. Though they had never exchanged words about what bound them together, they shared a tacit understanding of loss and mourning. Helena didn't push, didn't make promises of comfort, but her silent presence offered something rare, the acceptance that pain existed, but that it was not something to be feared. She spoke about grief not as something to be overcome, but as an intrinsic part of who we are, something that, over time, we can learn to carry without letting it define us. In the daily encounters with Helena, between quiet walks through the town or brief conversations in the small library where she worked, Isabela began to allow herself to be vulnerable. Little by little, she shared fragments of her life with Lucas, the love they had built and the brutal loss that destroyed it. Each word seemed heavy, but at the same time, it lightened a part of the weight in her chest. "You're still trapped in the pain," Helena said, her voice soft but firm. "The pain will always be with you, Isabela. But it doesn't have to be all that you are. It doesn't have to be all that you have." These words echoed in Isabela's mind, reverberating in her soul like a slow, sad melody. She knew in some way that Helena was right. Grief wouldn't disappear. The emptiness Lucas had left in her life could never be filled. But over time, she began to understand that this didn't mean she was condemned to live in darkness forever. There was something more, something beyond the pain. She began to reflect more on Lucas, not just as he was at the time of his death, but about what he had represented while he was alive. He had always encouraged her to move forward, not to let difficulties consume her. He believed in her potential, in her strength, even in the hardest moments. Would he have wanted her to stay trapped in the past, in constant mourning? Isabela began to believe that, deep down, Lucas would have wanted her to move forward, not in the sense of forgetting what they had lived, but in living again with his memory as part of her story but not defining her. The healing process was slow and uncertain, like a plant growing in barren soil with no promise of blossoming. Each day felt like an internal struggle, but something was changing. She no longer needed to hide from the pain. She could feel the longing and still continue to live. Healing, she realized, wasn't about forgetting, but about learning to live with the pain and the scars it left behind. As the months passed, Isabela began to allow herself to experience moments of lightness, to accept the sadness without drowning in it. The town, once so oppressive, began to seem more welcoming. The frozen lake, which had once seemed a reminder of tragedy, now accepted her in silence, like a witness to the painful journey she was undertaking. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but little by little she began to find space to live alongside it, without it taking over her entire life. Isabela reflected, sitting by the edge of the lake, looking at the horizon where the sky met the earth. Life was made of moments. Some wonderful, others devastating. There was no way to erase the past, but now she understood that it didn't have to be a prison anymore. She could move forward, carry her scars, and still find something new to live for. She slowly stood up, breathing in the cold morning air, and as she took the first steps toward her house, she felt that, for the first time in a long time, the weight of loneliness was no longer so overwhelming. She was learning to live with her memories, and little by little she began to believe that there was still something ahead. Not a new life, perhaps, but a rebuilt life, made of memories and new tentative steps but full of possibilities. Winter was beginning to show signs of departure. The town, which had once seemed shrouded in a mantle of ice and silence, now breathed softly with the first rays of sunlight touching the surface of the lake. The trees, still bare, seemed to patiently await the arrival of spring as if they too were in their own process of renewal. Isabela walked through the streets of the town with a lighter, firmer step. There was something different in her gaze, something that had been absent before, the sense that she was finally returning to herself. The days that followed were more filled, more alive, though deep down she knew that the pain would never completely fade. She had learned to live with it, to let it be a part of her story without being the whole story. She began to engage more with the local community. She visited the market more frequently, chatted with the few people who lived in the town, and even volunteered to help at the small bookstore that Helena ran. Slowly she became a constant presence, a thread of connection that had once seemed broken. But now, Isabela found joy in the small things. In unhurried conversations, in moments of shared silence, in the sense of belonging that she never imagined she would feel. When she passed by the frozen lake, now slowly thawing, she no longer felt the weight of tragedy. What had once been a symbol of her pain became a distant memory of a time that, even marked by loss, did not need to define who she was. She passed by there, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by Helena, and smiled at the water's reflection of the blue sky, the same sky Lucas had loved. The town, with its quiet calm, seemed to have been the necessary space for her to rebuild herself. There was no rush, no need to follow a linear path. Healing, she knew now, was not a straight line. It was a series of disconnected steps, small moments of progress followed by setbacks, but always moving forward even if slowly. Isabela had learned that grief, though inevitable, was not the end. It was a part of life, something that everyone at some point would face. But she also knew that, despite the pain, there was room for new discoveries and connections, for finding small signs of light where once there had only been darkness. She now saw that, by moving forward even hesitantly, she was creating something new for herself. A new life, not without scars but with a new way of looking at them. The epilogue of her journey was not an end, but a silent, delicate beginning. Life continued with all its ups and downs, but finally, Isabela was ready to be part of it again. She knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but also with possibilities. And perhaps, that was enough to give her the hope that, even in the darkness, there is always a light at the end of the tunnel.